So in Africa, I guess there are so many languages. There are more than there are approximately 2,000 actually languages that are in Africa, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit more. But as you can see in this slide, see all of those borders. That's not even the amount of borders that exist between actual cultural groups. Those are borders that existed after Europeans colonized in Africa, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on here. But these are some major language families in Africa. So I'll read these slides just kind of like I do every time, and I will sort of put in my own rhetoric and my own sort of anecdotes as we go along here and as we learn. So part one, we're looking at languages and literature in Africa. How do you use language? In what ways is language important in your life? It's very important in my life. Language is one of the most important elements of culture. In fact, nothing that we do together could work without language. Is there a Canadian language? That's a really good question. Think about that one for a second. Is there a Canadian language? English and French are Canada's official languages. But we know that people speak many different languages in Canada. Some Aboriginal languages, such as Nehiya, which is Cree, and Inuktitut, are spoken only in Canada. What expressions are unique to your region? What expressions do you use that are different from those your older family members use? Are we ready for this? Let's go. I said that for a reason. I wrote that in there for a reason. This past year, I hear every year I hear different phrases that you guys use. This year, a big popular, very popular phrase that you guys have going on is "let's go." You folks, I don't know in this class how many people do this, but many students at King's Edgell this past year, I've heard this. And this is how language spreads. It's fascinating, right? When I was growing up, you'd think this is quite funny because I'm quite a bit older than you guys, but when I was growing up in the 90s, we had a word called rad. Oh, that's rad. That's so radical, right? That meant something was really cool. People don't use that word anymore. It might come back. Language and culture work like that. They kind of things tend to come back and come around. But this year, that's the phrase I hear in the junior school. I'm hearing that a lot. Let's go, and it's awesome. It's very positive. It's very motivational. It's like it's used by a lot of hockey kids, but also it can be used in an academic sense. I've heard that. I've heard it used in many different sort of fields, which is really awesome when you start thinking about language in that way. So this is just a little bit of perspective. These images show a sofa, a young person wearing a type of knitted hat, paper napkins, and a gutter on the underside of a roof. What are the Canadian words for each of these items? I'm not going to tell you in this presentation. I want you to actually try to figure that out on your own. You're probably already thinking about it. Can you think of other words or expressions that come out of our culture? So out of our English-Canadian culture, are there some words that we use that other countries or other cultures may also use, but not as much as we do? One word that I can think of is a. We always are. I mean, that's very, that's a little bit of a stereotype, but it is a word that we use a lot. And the more and more I think about it, it's not that stereotypical. We do use the word a lot, and I do, right? I'd use that word a lot, and you guys know that. The languages of Africa. More languages are spoken in Africa than on any other continent. 1/3 of all the world's languages are found in Africa. Some languages are still being discovered there. Can you imagine that? That's fascinating. And others are disappearing. Here are some quick facts. The number of languages, approximately 2,000 in one continent. 2,000. Think about how many languages we have in Canada. We have many, but we have 2 official languages. That's English and French, right? But we have so many other languages in Canada, but likely not up to the number of 2,000. The number of languages with fewer than 500 speakers, 140. There's 140 full languages with fewer than 500 speakers. We need to think about what a language is. A language can tell stories. A language can have an alphabet, can have some languages have written words, like English, and many languages have written words, but some don't. Some languages are only spoken. The number of languages close to extinction, that means, far fewer than 500 speakers, is 37. Think about that. That's a lot of languages. 37 languages are close to becoming extinct. That's quite sad. And we can learn a lot from language. There's a lot of creativity that we can use and a lot of perspective that we can gain from researching languages that are becoming extinct. Language families. Many languages around the world can be grouped into language families. So this means that they share lots of words and other features. So you can imagine if there are 2,000 languages in Africa, there are likely some of those languages are pretty similar, I imagine, right? This means that they share words and other features. So French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, they all belong to a family called Romantic languages. You may have heard from your parents or other people in your life that sometimes if you know French really well or if you know Spanish really well, you probably can speak both languages a little bit. If you know French fluently, you already know quite a few Spanish words and vice versa. Okay, so some Aboriginal languages in North America also belong to family groups. So Mi'kmaq is part of the Algonquin language family and is spoken in Atlantic provinces. Algonquin languages are also spoken in Quebec, in Ontario, and the Prairie provinces, so that's Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and the east coast of the United States. The United Nations has identified 4 major language families in Africa. And these are the ones from our textbook right here. We see in the purple section, we see Afro-Asiatic. In the yellow section, we see Nilo-Saharan. In the pink section, we see Niger-Congo. And in the brown section, we see Khoisan. Okay, so these are your sort of 4 main language families that all of the languages in Africa come from. So you can imagine all the different languages in the Afro-Asiatic family likely share words. So they probably can somewhat speak to each other, but maybe not too much. And some are probably similar than others. So the major language families in Africa, here's another table right from your textbook that's really important. So it gives us a sense of some of these families, of which families are the biggest ones. Obviously, the language from Niger-Congo in the region of sub-Saharan Africa, including West Africa, it's so many more languages than the rest of them. 1,436 languages there, and the number of speakers, 360 million. Wow, that's a lot of different languages and a lot of different word use. Think about that. In North Africa, we have 371 languages. 175 million people speak those languages. In the Nilo-Saharan, Central and East Africa, we have 196 languages. That means 11 million speakers there. And Khoisan, in Southwest Africa, we have 35 languages and about 100,000 speakers. So that shows the major African language families. Interesting. As for European colonies in Africa, so in the 19th century, European countries set up colonies in Africa. A colony is an area that the people of another country settle in and control. Britain, France, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, they were all main colonial powers. These were the countries that went and colonized in Africa. They divided the African continent among themselves at first. They named the colonies and set up governments, all without the permission of the African peoples. Peoples who had lived together in traditional groups for centuries now found themselves divided by national borders created by European rulers. European languages and Christianity were introduced. It's kind of sad when you think about it. Colonization is a bit of a sad story because you hear about languages and culture being divided and languages and culture being lost because of it. And it's a little bit bittersweet because there are some positive aspects to colonization as well. It's helped our world globalize, right? We're all speaking English. But and we're all communicating together and able to start really interesting businesses and make lots of money and have great, beautiful lives. But there's also a really dark part to colonization, right? Colonization in the past 500 to 1,000 years, colonization has really helped the world change in a huge way, and not totally for the better, right? Many languages will be lost due to colonization. We can think about Canada right here. Many languages in Canada have been lost due to colonization. A very good friend of mine, his brother his name is Jeremy Dutcher, and Jeremy Dutcher is a musician who took some really interesting language from a culture called Maliseet, and that's an Aboriginal culture in New Brunswick, an Aboriginal group. And he took some really old recordings of this language that is going obsolete, and took these really old recordings and sort of preserved them in a way and made some really neat music out of them. I really want to show you some of that, and so I'll put a music video of his at the end of this presentation. You'll be able to see that, because it's a perfect example of how we should be working to preserve language. So European colonies in Africa, you can see how many cultural borders there once were. I'm only showing you this slide to show you how many cultural borders there existed in Africa before they were colonized by European countries. Look at all of the little tiny gray lines. So like literally hundreds or thousands of different traditional groups, different cultures of people existed in that country. And then it was colonized by Africa, and you can see the sort of lighter lines. Those are the new borders of the new countries that you would have drawn all out, right, when you made that map. Imagine if I had you, I can just picture Will smiling right now, but imagine if I had you draw out the map of Africa and name every single one of those cultures that existed before colonization. Maybe that will be my next project for you. 1950s and the 1960s. In the 50s and 60s, most African colonies became independent countries. So that means they split off from after having been colonized by those countries in Europe. They kind of allowed them to become independent, and that was a really good story. However, these countries kept the borders that the Europeans had created during their colonial rule. So today, European languages are still spoken along with African languages in most of those African countries. That's why we have people learning how to speak French, of course, in a country like Ghana. So Yoruba is a really interesting culture and interesting people. There are people who were divided among different countries in West Africa when Europeans introduced those new national borders. But the Yoruba have a rich history and are still a vibrant cultural group today. There are about 20 million speakers of Yoruba in Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool that they actually that's one culture that really kept their original language and their original way of life. So that's part one. That's sort of meant to cover everything from the first class of today. If you want to take a quick break, you're welcome to do so. I understand that it's only been about 14-15 minutes, but that's totally fine. And so now we are heading on to part two, and we're going to be talking about preserving language. So part two, preserving language. Today, English is the main language used in business and trade around the world. It is also the language of computers and technology. Earlier in this chapter, you learned that some languages in Africa are becoming extinct. This disappearance is one of the impacts of globalization. What other impacts of globalization do you recall from earlier units and chapters? Think about the ecozones, for example. Think about the work we've done with the economy. Think about politics. How has all of this been impacted by globalization? And if you look at this picture right here, it's a very good image of what globalization really means. It just is the direct connection we all have now due to the airline industry, the internet, right? When we are not going through a global pandemic, we can fly around the world in hours, right? We can be places all the time. And so we're constantly sharing language, constantly sharing culture. But of course, when we do that, certain languages and certain cultures are kind of going to beat out others. And that's where, unfortunately, we see some cultures and some languages becoming extinct. And that really is a sad story because, the more culture we have and the more languages we can hold and keep, the more we can all learn about each other. So preserving language is really important. What can African countries do to preserve their cultures and languages? Should they use Canada as a model? That's a really good question because I'm going to kind of give you a bit of information about what we do to try to preserve Canadian culture. Canadians are concerned about preserving our culture. Some people worry about the impact of American culture from down south. That makes a lot of sense. In the United States, they have so many more people. They have, and with that much more population, they're able to produce a massive amount of music, films, and television programs. So Canadians have looked for ways to preserve their culture in the face of this giant influence. What do you think the guidelines should be for Canadian content in the media? Think about that for a second. And then I show this picture right here because you'll see why in a second. But in this picture, children learn how to code in Tanzania, in Africa. So these kids are learning how to use robots and things and also how to code on a computer. How can people in Africa preserve their languages while taking part in the global economy or network or learning about media like this? So to ensure there is enough Canadian content, the government has rules. The Canadian government requires that 35% of the songs played by radio stations must be Canadian. That's really kind of cool. To be classed as Canadian, a song must meet at least two of these requirements. They must be performed by a Canadian, be written by a Canadian, be composed by a Canadian, and or be produced by a Canadian. Cool, eh? It is actually very cool. And it particularly is cool for me personally, because I'm a musician. I release music all the time. And what's really neat is sometimes radios and radio stations, sometimes they really want to play my music, but sometimes they have to play my music, which is so cool. Sometimes radio shows or radio hosts will call me up or send me a message, and they'll be like, we need Canadian content, right? We're playing a lot of American content right now, and in order to be working with the law here, we need more Canadian content. So can we use one of your songs? And of course, I'm like, absolutely. That's not always how things happen. That it kind of sounds like I'm like a last resort, but that's really not how it is. But it's an example of how it can work, right? It's kind of neat that if you are a radio host or if you have a radio show in Canada and you produce radio or any kind of media, that you have to have that certain percentage of Canadian content. I just think that's the coolest thing. So television stations must also show Canadian programs. However, the question is, how much is enough? Some Canadians want to hear foreign programs and music. So think about that radio host asking me to play my song. Some of those listeners, maybe it's a show about American music, right? Which is like, well, why are we playing my song on a show about American music? Well, you have to, right? And some people want to preserve that Canadian culture. Is it too much to require 100% Canadian content or 50%? Do you think that would be too much Canadian content? I think it would, personally, because I do like hearing other content. Should African countries follow Canada's example and require a certain amount of content from their own country on their media programs? Is this possible when there are so many different languages? Those are really good questions to ask. And it comes a lot down to education. So your assignment today is in two parts. Number one, they both are in discussion forums under assignments in your MyKES on Blackbaud. So, number one, I want you to find a language in Africa to research. That can be any one of the languages that we spoke about today. We didn't actually name any of them, but I want you to actually research and find those yourself. One of them, for example, would be Swahili. I don't want you all to choose Swahili. I want you to go and find some unique and different ones. Use the internet to help you. There are literally 2,000 of them. I want you to find one of them and write down 10 words and their English translations in the discussion forum lesson under assignments. Some of those languages will only be spoken languages, which means you wouldn't be able to choose those. You have to choose a language that has some sort of writing that could be translated to our alphabet, which there are many of them. But I would like you to find one of those and write down 10 words and 10 of their translations. And just out of sake of interest, I also want you to write down the name of the language, because we're not going to know if you just put down the 10 words and the English translations. That's number one. Shouldn't take too long. And it'll be interesting. Number two, the second discussion forum I want you to fill out answers this question. Canadian schools teach a variety of languages. We teach English, French, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Inuktitut, and Inuiamun. These languages are taught at different schools. We obviously don't teach Inuktitut. However, maybe we will in the future. If that language kind of comes back in a big way, it would be really cool to teach a class on Inuktitut. Although we definitely would teach Mi'kmaq in some of in a course in the senior school, you definitely would learn a bit of Mi'kmaq. Some Canadian students learn Cantonese, Urdu, or other languages outside of regular class hours. In Cape Breton, Gaelic is taught. So cool. Why should schools play a major role in preserving languages? Or actually, I should even take out the word why there. I want to ask you, should schools play a major role in preserving languages? I want you to write one paragraph to support your answer in the discussion forum under assignments. Okay, so your 2 assignments today: 1, find one of those languages in Africa, research it online, write down those 10 words and their 10 English translations. 2, write one paragraph to tell me why you think schools should play a major role in preserving languages. Okay, that's excellent. I'm excited to see your responses. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.